Hey everybody, it's Dr. A, and thank you so much for tuning in and watching our first video lesson. I think today will be very helpful as you get an opportunity to kind of have the control in your hands today. You get to pause me whenever you want to, you can rewind me if you need to. So again, this gives you a little bit more say-so in how you're going to get your content during our lecture time. Now, one of the things that I'd like to do before we get started is to just bring you up to speed with where we are in our content. Last time we had a chance to meet, we got an opportunity to talk about a few things related to nutrition and a few things related to the digestive system. And of course, those two things go hand in hand. And what we did to hopefully bring the content together a little bit is we followed the passageway of food from the oral cavity to the rectum, and we called that the alimentary canal. Now, what I'd like us to do in today's lesson is to delve into a concept that we're terming carbohydrate metabolism. And so you're familiar with the term metabolism. We defined that last time as the sum of all chemical reactions that are occurring in the body, and we said further that metabolism is made up of two other terms as well. We have a catabolism component, which means that things are being broken down, and we also have an anabolism component, which means that things are being built up. And so now that we have that solid definition of metabolism, let's take a second to define carbohydrate. Now, I understand that you may know that term and know how to define it, but I think it always is a benefit to review things like that just so that it's fresh in our mind. So here's how I'd like you to define it. And if you're taking notes with me, please feel free to jot this down. I'm going to give it to you the way I wrote it just so that you've got it perfectly clear. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates, we can define it this way. These are the fibers, starches, and sugars that we find in grains that we consume, vegetables that we may consume, in milk products that we may consume, and also in the fruits that we may consume. So that's kind of our overall standard definition of carbohydrates. Now, we can take that definition that we just provided and we can break that off into two larger categories. The first category would be simple carbohydrates, and then our other category would be complex carbohydrates. So if we talk about simple carbohydrates here for a second, these are going to be the carbohydrates that our body can digest and process very quickly. These are the kinds that are oftentimes associated with sugar highs, where you've got this burst of energy and then soon afterwards you've got kind of this immediate crash that happens right after. And with these simple carbohydrates, another thing that we can consider is that they are made up of one or two sugars together. So let me give you just a quick recap here. We're saying that we've got this term carbohydrates, and on one hand we have simple carbohydrates, on the other we've got complex carbohydrates, and we're saying that our simple carbohydrates are again digested very quickly by the body. They can give us that sugar high where we've got a very fast crash right afterwards, and they contain one or two sugars. And when we talk about them being made up of either one or two sugars, the term that typically goes with that is either monosaccharides for a one sugar or a simple sugar, or disaccharides for two sugars together. And so again, that's our simple carbohydrates. Now for our complex carbohydrates, these are the ones that are the best for us. And what we mean by that is that these are the carbohydrates that we might typically find in our green leafy vegetables and things of that nature. But our complex carbohydrates take a significantly greater amount of time to digest in comparison to our simple carbohydrates. And because it takes them longer to digest comparatively, that means that we're going to have a sustained level of energy over the course of time. And when we talk about these complex carbohydrates, the term that we oftentimes associate with it are polysaccharides. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good definition and starting point for what we are talking about here as it relates to carbohydrate metabolism. Now, here's the next thing that I want to do as we go to one of the images that you have in your packet. Again, we've got carbohydrates, and we could view them just as you see here on the screen as our polysaccharides, disaccharides, and then again our monosaccharides. Now, let's assume that you or I have just consumed a carbohydrate-rich meal. And let's assume that you had more of the complex carbohydrates, which means that we're going to start here at the top. Now, those polysaccharides, or again, those complex carbs that we've just eaten, they are going to, of course, be digested, and they're going to make their way through the alimentary canal, which we see here. Now, as they make their way through the alimentary canal, we're going to have several processes that help to break down that food. But in this particular diagram, we're looking at two things in particular that help make the digestion process that much easier. First, we're looking at salivary amylase and pancreatic amylase. And so these are two enzymes that are going to play a part or join in with a process that we call hydrolysis. And together, those things are going to break our polysaccharides down into disaccharides. Now, once we've gotten the breakdown into our disaccharides, those sugars are going to be ultimately broken down into monosaccharides. Now, there's another part that plays a role here. These disaccharides are broken down even further due to something that we call brush border enzymes. And these brush border enzymes are listed here. The terms that you see are sucrase, lactase, and maltase. And so again, they're going to break down some of those disaccharides and turn them into our simple sugars. Now, here's where I'd like you to maybe add some drawings to your notes here. When we talk about these polysaccharides, there are some examples that I want you to have at your fingertip here. So if you don't mind, let's jot this down. By our polysaccharides, some examples that we're going to have here are cellulose. And cellulose is a type of dietary fiber, but that's an example of a polysaccharide. We're also going to have glycogen here. And the third one that we'll add is starch. So if you're eating some food and you happen to see those labels on the nutrition aspect or the nutrition label itself, those are considered to be polysaccharides. Now, examples of our disaccharides would be things like lactose, sucrose, and maltose. And our monosaccharides here, this would be things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. Here's what's going to happen. After we've had our polysaccharides that have been broken down into our disaccharides and then our monosaccharides, the one that's of interest to us particularly here is glucose. And now what's going to happen is that monosaccharide glucose is going to make its way into the bloodstream. And after it's made its way into the bloodstream, its next destination is going to be our liver. And so we'll add that to our notes here as well. And one of the things that we'll see here that becomes even more interesting is that if we've had the monosaccharides such as galactose and fructose, as they are entering the liver, they're going to be converted into glucose. And so that's why we put an asterisk here earlier. Glucose is essentially what we are saying is our end product to carbohydrate digestion. So let's continue and take a look at the next content that we've got in our sheet. So if you take a look at this sheet, what we're looking at now is a very brief summary chart of a process that we refer to as cellular respiration. Now, you've probably had an opportunity to view the learning support videos on this, but if not, this particular slide or this content will give you the gist of it, but I do strongly recommend going back to your learning support videos and making sure you've got a solid understanding of the content here. Now, the first thing that I want to do, and I'll write this down with you, is I want us to jot down the location of these processes that take place. So again, here's what we're saying. Cellular respiration is a combination of glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, which is also known as the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport system, oftentimes referred to as the electron transport chain. Now, the locations, again, are very important. When we talk about glycolysis, this is a process that takes place in the cytoplasm of a given cell. So let's add that to our notes here, that this is taking place in the cytoplasm. And for our remaining two components, the citric acid cycle and the electron transport system or chain, this takes place specifically in the mitochondria. So let's add that to our notes here as well. All right, so now that we've gotten that jotted down, let's talk about kind of the beginning product and the end product for each of these particular components. Now, for glycolysis, our beginning component here is glucose. And so here's what I want to do. I want to kind of tie a couple of things together for a second. We just talked about a moment ago how when we have the breakdown of carbohydrates, our end product is glucose. And so because our end product was glucose for carbohydrate digestion, glycolysis, or for glycolysis, our starting point will be the end product of digestion for carbohydrates. So for us, our beginning product here is again glucose. Now, what's going to happen to that glucose is that it's going to be broken down, and we're going to have a few end products here. And here's what I'd like you to jot down in your notes as well. Our end products are going to be a molecule that we refer to as pyruvate, and there are two of those. There are going to be 2 ATP molecules. And we oftentimes will say that there are 2 molecules of water. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but the water isn't as important for us, but it is a part of the process. So we'll include it here in our list of the end products associated with glycolysis. So let's take a look at our next column here as we take a look at the citric acid cycle. Now, for the citric acid cycle, our beginning product here is going to be essentially a continuation of what we saw just a second ago from glycolysis. And so our beginning product here is what we will refer to as our 2-pyruvate. And the end product of this, we're going to have a few components here. We're going to have one ATP molecule. We're going to have 3 NADH molecules. And we'll talk more about this later on. But we'll also have an FADH2 molecule as well. Now, for our last column here, as we look at the electron transport system, our beginning product here is going to be something that we refer to as hydrogen ions. And again, this is a little bit more of an involved process, but we're just kind of scaling it down for the sake of simplicity. And so again, our beginning product here is hydrogen ions, and we'll just show it this way. We've got some hydrogen ions, and the end product of our total cellular respiration process is somewhere between 32 and roughly 36 molecules of ATP. So again, this is the process, cellular respiration, by which our body takes a molecule of glucose and makes energy for the body. Alright, so if you will, allow me just a moment to show you another diagram here that puts this process of cellular respiration into maybe a better perspective for you, just so that you can see it play out fully. So in this diagram that you're able to see, this is again representing a few things, but primarily it's representing the process of cellular respiration. So here's what I like to do. I'd like to create some notes on this image, and if you don't mind, add this to your notes as well. I believe this will be something that definitely helps you as we continue going through this content. Now, again, I can't say enough great things about this particular diagram because what it does and what it represents is a sum total of a few of the processes that we're going to talk about in just a few moments. So if you ever feel like you get lost as we talk about carbohydrate metabolism, I'd like you to come back to this particular image because it'll be a great way to help you gain clarity on where you are and kind of where things rest as it relates to this topic. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First, what we're going to do and identify here is glucose. That is essentially our starting point. And we say that it's our starting point here because remember, with our carbohydrates, we have it starting essentially at some kind of polysaccharide, and then it's broken down into glucose at the end. And so that's why we're starting here for this particular process. So here's what I'd like us to consider. We're starting here at glucose, and what we're saying is that glucose is going to go through the first part of cellular respiration, which we call glycolysis. And as glucose goes through the process of glycolysis, it again is going to become something that we call pyruvate. And right here, you see it referred to by another name, but it's the same thing. Here it's listed as pyruvic acid. But again, pyruvic acid and pyruvate are the same. So again, real quick, we started with glucose, and through the process of glycolysis, our glucose is now pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And so we're going to look at this first from the aerobic pathway. And just so that we've got this and so we don't lose it, when we talk about this aerobic pathway, we're talking about there being sufficient oxygen levels in the body that enable this process to work. And so if we've got sufficient oxygen levels available, this pyruvate or this pyruvic acid will go through this aerobic pathway, and as it goes through this aerobic pathway, it is going to release or get rid of some carbon dioxide. Now, as it gets rid of that carbon dioxide here, we're going to have the transformation of that pyruvate to something that we call acetyl coenzyme A. Now, this acetyl coenzyme A is going to go through our citric acid cycle, and this is basically just like a continuing spinning wheel. Our acetyl coenzyme A goes through that citric acid cycle, and after it goes through that citric acid cycle, it's going to make its way into our electron transport system. And this is where we're going to again have our net roughly 36 molecules of ATP. So again, that's what happens when we have sufficient oxygen levels available for the body. So the question becomes, well, what if we don't have sufficient levels of oxygen available? And maybe better yet, when might we not have sufficient levels of oxygen available? You might be saying, okay, I don't understand how or why that would happen. Well, probably the best example that I could give you is that imagine that you've been outside or you've been inside and you've been working very vigorously, doing some kind of exercise. You could be in a place or in a position where you don't have sufficient oxygen levels immediately available to the body. If that is the case, we're going to have a process that we refer to as the anaerobic pathway take place. So if we look at this anaerobic pathway, here's what this is going to look like. And again, we're starting with glucose here. So our glucose is going to go through the process of glycolysis, and after glycolysis has had its work, glucose will be converted again into our pyruvic acid or into what we call pyruvate. So for this one, we'll again say that glucose was our first component of this process. Again, it's going through glycolysis, and here we're still going to have pyruvate. But this time, again, if there's insufficient oxygen available, we'll make a note of that. Insufficient oxygen available. What's going to happen is that pyruvate will then go down this anaerobic pathway, and it's going to be converted into something that we call lactic acid. Now, typically a lot of people love to ask the question, is lactic acid what normally leads to muscle soreness after exercise? And the comments and or the research on this had been varied for a while, but what science has kind of told us is that no, it's not necessarily due to lactic acid. The soreness that usually builds up after a workout is usually due to something that's called delayed onset muscle soreness. But again, that's a different topic for a different day. But again, that pyruvate or that pyruvic acid is going to go down this anaerobic pathway, meaning there's not sufficient oxygen levels immediately for the body. And so it's going to turn that pyruvate into lactic acid. So we'll just make a note of that this is our third step here. And this lactic acid has the ability, which we'll talk about more in just a second, this lactic acid has the ability to be converted back into glucose, which is going to be very helpful for us. So here's where we're at now. This glucose, if it's been converted from our lactic acid, this glucose can now go through another process that we'll talk about momentarily called glycogenesis, and that could allow this glucose to be stored. And anytime we have glucose that's stored, we generally refer to it as glycogen. Now, kind of in a similar way, this glucose that we have here could go straight back through the process of glycolysis. And again, if there's oxygen available, it's going to go down our aerobic pathway. If there is still an insufficient amount of oxygen available, it's going to go down this anaerobic pathway again. But here at our glucose, if that glucose becomes stored as glycogen, here's what can happen next. So we'll label this as number 4. If our glucose was stored as glycogen, our glycogen can be broken down through a process that we call glycogenolysis. And so through glycogenolysis, our glycogen can now return or become glucose. And from there, of course, that glucose is going to be converted into pyruvate through glycolysis. And then again, we'll have the option to go down this aerobic pathway or this anaerobic pathway. So again, this is a really great home base for us as we talk about carbohydrate metabolism. So if you need to, I strongly recommend coming back to this slide to help you get a sense of where things are as we finish this particular content for today. So let's take just a moment and look at the next process that we have in our worksheet here. Now, this process is referred to as the Cory Cycle. Now, what's unique about this particular process is that we actually just saw it play out just a moment ago. Now, of interest to us in this process is something that we refer to as lactic acid. Now, the lactic acid that we're referring to that's present here in the Cory cycle, it is there because of the process that we looked at just a moment ago. So notice that we initially had glucose, and this glucose went through the process of glycolysis. And through that process of glycolysis, we then had the formation of pyruvate, also referred to as pyruvic acid. Now, we said that we did not yet have a sufficient level of oxygen in the body, and so this pyruvic acid could not go down the aerobic pathway. Instead, the pyruvic acid had to go down the anaerobic pathway, and that is again where we got the lactic acid. And so as we look at the Cory cycle, this lactic acid is directly from our anaerobic pathway that we just looked at. So let's do some diagramming on this particular image, and let's also create maybe some bulleted notes so that we can follow this process exactly. Now, we're going to label our lactic acid here as number 1 because that's our starting point. And so what we're saying is that this lactic acid, again, is there just because of the previously formed anaerobic pathway. So this lactic acid will have an opportunity to move into the bloodstream. And so we'll label that as number 2. And so now that this lactic acid is in the bloodstream, its target destination is now going to be the liver. And so we'll label that as number 3. So now that we've had the movement of lactic acid into the liver, that lactic acid has the opportunity in a way that's unique to the liver cell. It has the unique opportunity to convert to pyruvate or to pyruvic acid. And from pyruvate, it can then format glucose. So let's put some numbers here just so that we don't lose sight of what's taking place. We again had our lactic acid here. And so now we're showing that that lactic acid could form into pyruvate, and from pyruvate to glucose. Now, because we are at glucose, we've got some unique options and some unique things that can take place. This glucose can be stored in the liver as glycogen. So we're going to let that be our number 6. Again, we're saying that our glucose can be stored as glycogen. However, that glucose also has the opportunity to move back into the bloodstream. So we'll make that our number 7. And so if our glucose has moved back into the bloodstream, it can then re-enter a given muscle cell. So let's imagine that it's done that. It's re-entered our muscle cell that we have here. And so now that it's in the muscle cell, again as glucose, we've got some options. That glucose could be stored in the muscle as glycogen. And so we're going to make that our number 8. Now, if it stays as glucose, which is what we had to deal with initially, if it stays in that form, that glucose is going to go through its process of glycolysis, and it's going to be converted into pyruvic acid, or again, what we refer to as pyruvate. So let's create some numbers here just so we don't lose sight of what's happened. We're going to say that that glucose has the opportunity to be converted into pyruvate. Now, what happens next is that pyruvate has the opportunity to go along an aerobic pathway, or it's going to have the opportunity to go down an anaerobic pathway. So let's create some numbering here just so we don't lose sight of this. Now that we've got this pyruvate, again, there are 2 options. We've got our aerobic pathway, we'll make that 10, and we've got our anaerobic pathway, which will make our number 11 here. And so if we happen to have the pyruvate that goes this aerobic pathway, we're going to now have, again, the process of the citric acid cycle take place, and then we'll go directly from there into the electron transport system. But if our pyruvate is here and there is not sufficient levels of oxygen available, we're going to go right back down this anaerobic pathway again. And if we go down that anaerobic pathway again, we're going to end right back up almost where we started here with the Cory cycle at lactic acid. So we're going to make this our number 12. And so this process could essentially keep repeating itself, which is why we call it the Cory cycle. It's a cycle of almost a continuous process that happens in the body. So let's take a look at our next diagram. Now, for this diagram, we're going to be talking about a process referred to as glycogenesis. And one of the first things that I want to do before we delve into a little bit of the process is I'd like for us to take this term and dissect it just a little bit. Now, the term that we have here, the prefix, if you will, glyco, is referring to glycogen. And if I were to ask you what the word genesis means, or if I were to ask you what the word genesis means, you would probably say it means the beginning of something or the origin of something, and that's of course exactly correct. And so we'll say that this term, glycogenesis, means glycogen formation. And so let's take a look at how this particular process happens. Now, for glycogenesis, what we need to think about is what would happen if there was too much sugar or too much glucose in the bloodstream. So if we happen to have too much sugar or too much glucose in the bloodstream, we'd essentially end up with almost like a traffic jam of glucose trying to get somewhere. And if we happen to have this traffic jam of glucose, what's going to happen is that our glucose molecules are going to start to stick together. So let me show you what that's going to look like. This particular image that you see here is a molecule of glucose or a molecule of sugar. And if we've got several of these molecules within our bloodstream, if it becomes too jam-packed, here's what's going to happen. We're going to actually start to see the bonding of these forms of glucose together. And as these glucose molecules bind together, we're essentially going to say that they turn into a stored version of themselves, which we call glycogen. So essentially, what happened here is we went through the process of having several molecules of glucose bonding or forming together to create glycogen. And so that process in and of itself is pretty simple, right? Again, glucose molecules, with there being too many of them, they're going to work and bind together to be stored for future use. Now, let's take a look at the next process that we have here. This next process is referred to as glycogenolysis. Now, through glycogenolysis, again, I want us to take the name at face value because the name truly does give us a really good sense of all that's taking place here. So let's look at this process and explore a few more things about it. All right, so with this process, again, glycogenolysis, the first thing that I want us to look at is the first part of this term. We've got the term glycogen here. And so we just saw just a moment ago that glycogen is the stored form of carbohydrates. So for glycogen, we've simply got glycogen. And this end portion of our term here, lysis, essentially means the breakdown. Okay, so here's where we are. We have glycogen that is stored in the liver cell. And if you remember from just a moment ago, we saw in the Cory cycle that glucose can be stored in the liver as glycogen. So the glycogen that we're seeing here is exactly that. It is the stored form of glucose. And here's what we're saying. This stored form of glucose, called glycogen, can only stay in this state for so long. It's almost like the body decides to store this glycogen or this glucose as energy that might be needed in the future. And so this glycogen is going to go through a series of chemical reactions, specifically through the use of some enzymes. It is going to be broken down into glucose. And once it's broken down into glucose, that glucose will then enter the bloodstream. And as it has entered the bloodstream, we're now going to have the opportunity for that glucose molecule to go through the process of glycolysis. And after it does this, it can choose to go the aerobic pathway if sufficient oxygen is available, or if insufficient levels of oxygen are available, it's going to go down this anaerobic pathway. So let's make a note of that just so that we can showcase this process happening. Again, that glucose can either go the aerobic pathway or it can go an anaerobic pathway. So let's take a look at the last diagram that we have for this particular lesson for today. All right, for this last process, we're going to look at something called gluconeogenesis. And just like we've done before, I think looking at the name of this process really gives you an idea of what exactly is happening. So here's what I want you to look at. The first part of this word, gluco, for us, this relates to glucose. So let's make a note of that. And we've got kind of another term here embedded right after neo. And neo here essentially just means new. And the last portion is genesis, a term that we looked at before, which we said means the beginning or maybe the formation of something. And so we'll just use the term formation here. So if we put this together with gluconeogenesis, we have new glucose formation. Now, this process is unique, and we would see this process particularly if our body is in a state where there is not enough glucose available. So we would see this take place if, let's say, someone hadn't eaten in a long period of time and the body needed to generate some form of energy. This process would become activated. So let's kind of look at and see what happens here. Now, notice that for this process, we're going to have the participation of fat tissue, which is what you see here by adipose cell, and we're going to have the participation of regular tissue cells that have some form of stored protein. So here's what happens. Our fat tissue is going to become broken down into two components. So here's our fat. It's going to be broken down into one part that we call fatty acids and the second part that we call glycerol. So the fat is broken down into those two components, and both of those components enter the bloodstream. Now, after those components have entered the bloodstream, what we'll see here is that the glycerol component of fat is going to enter the liver cell on its own. So we'll make that our number 3 here. That again, the glycerol component has entered the liver. Now, the other part that's playing a role in the formation of this new form of glucose is again going to be our tissue here that has some amount of protein that's stored. So in this tissue cell, the protein is going to be broken down into some amino acids. So we'll show that our proteins have become activated, so to speak, here as number 4, and they'll be broken down into our amino acids. Now, those amino acids enter the bloodstream, which is what we see here, and after they enter the bloodstream, they're going to make their way into the liver, which is here. And so we'll make a note of that, and we'll label this as number 6. Now, here's the unique and interesting thing about this. Within the liver cell, we're going to have a series of chemical reactions that take place that allow this glycerol from fat and the amino acids from our protein here to work together and make for us sugar, which we call glucose. And that's our 7th step here. And now that we have this glucose in the actual liver, that glucose could then return to the bloodstream and be used right away as a form of energy. Well, I hope that was helpful for you. We've had an opportunity to look at several processes that relate to carbohydrate metabolism. In next week's video lesson, we'll have an opportunity to look at how this process is similar as relates to fats and proteins. That's it for today. Thank you guys so much, and I'll look forward to seeing you later on.